Courtney Newton, who is the vice president with United Way of Central Alabama.
Assistant Vice President.
Assistant Vice President, I'm sorry. Now, you're Assistant Vice President. What is your function at United Way?
I do community outreach, so that includes disaster response, of course. But in addition, I work with our workforce development program. I also work with our homelessness activities or initiatives. These are all initiatives. So I work with our homeless initiative and our senior initiatives.
And with you being in United Way for Central Alabama, you've got several counties, not just the Birmingham area.
We have a primary focus on the 5 central Alabama counties, so basically Jefferson County and the surrounding counties. And then, but also due to our capacity, we actually have a lot of statewide things, so you'll catch us involved in statewide stuff as well.
Now, Courtney, how long have you been with United Way?
8 years.
And
nine years in July.
9 years in July. So what did you do prior to United Way?
Prior to United Way, I lived in New York for about 14 years. And when I came back, I got involved with actually one of United Way's agencies. And most of my work has been around community outreach.
So that's been your career's community outreach?
Interesting enough, yes.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, I started as a college admissions counselor. It was my first career after I graduated, was a college admissions counselor. I've done marketing rep, so.
Well, what led you to this particular area?
It got assigned to me, just to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, I came into United Way at a time when our department wasn't huge. I think there was about 10 people in the department, and so everybody, what they needed at the time was a community outreach person. They just needed somebody. We had a lot of program staff folks who their job was to actually administer the program. What we didn't have United Way was a connector who went out in the community, kind of established partnerships or established relationships, and then cultivate those relationships. And so that was my role initially, and that's how I kind of fell into this, is that I would go out in the community, talk about our programs, try to see how to match what we were doing with what the community needed, and then bring that back to the leadership, and we work on those things that we could do. I mean, we couldn't do everything, but those things that we could. But we always wanted the community to know that we were there and we were interested in what they were doing, and that if we saw a need that was not met by one of the counties, by one of the initiatives, then we might explore doing it. A great example is, and this is prior to my attendance, prior to my employment, but a great example of what that role is the community food bank that we have today. That community food bank started because folks at United Way went out and talked to the community, and they found out that while, ABC Church had a food bank, they weren't really working with CDE food bank. And so we created a community food bank, which was a kind of a coalition, and it grew and grew and grew, and now it's its own organization that serves, I believe they serve 4 counties now.
So now when you took this position with United Way, now were you given, I guess in a way, carte blanche, or did you have?
No, and disaster wasn't one of them, by the way, but I was given homelessness, transportation, seniors, and gosh, there's one other area that I just do not recall. And but yeah, I kind of had a specific focus at that time that was geared at those. It was 4 areas. I just don't recall what they all were.
So let me step back for a second. Now, you said that your background had been in counseling and marketing. Do you think it prepared you for going into working with United Way?
Absolutely. Marketing, business background is what I have, and everything you can. That's a good blanket for almost everything we do. Not just United Way, but I think professionally, personally, I approach it. I mean, making who we've all heard the phrase, it's not what you know, it's who you know. Well, that's kind of my job. My job is to know who to work with. Who do you outreach to? But do it in a way that advances the mission of United Way. And our mission is to increase the organized capacity for communities to care for one another, care for themselves, And so that's what I'm doing. I'm out saying, how do we leverage United Way's strength with the community's need? We can't always do it, but those times we can. And sometimes, United Way can be a big, daunting organization at times. And so for that small rural community, what they need is someone who kind of helps them navigate. So I think of myself as that at times. I'm just a navigator. I just say, okay, well, this is how you get through our system so that your community gets the need that gets the help they need. But from the United Way angle, I'm connecting United Way with the folks that they want to reach out to. So I think in the military they call it tip of the spear. That's the kind of attitude I take about it. And my background as far as preparing me for it, yeah, I mean, I worked with high school students, and I'll tell you that's a group that if you figure out the needs of if you can help think about a high school senior, think about what you were doing when you were a senior. If you can sit down a high school senior and help them focus and come up with a plan for the next 5 years or 4 years, then yeah, you learn a lot of little tricks about how do you break down what people want versus what they need, in a way that empowers them, because that's the ultimate goal. You never want to tell people what to do if you can. If you can avoid telling people what to do and help them come up with their own plan, you help them forever.
How do you feel and that's a great philosophy, by the way, and I think I really see that coming out in you, because as we're sitting here, you're very energetic on this topic. So how do you feel about with what you're doing with United Way? Because obviously in Alabama, we have, very strong weather patterns that come through our state. And you've taken community outreach, it seems like, and you've really expanded it. And that's why I was kind of asking you about when you were put into this position, if you had carte blanche, because it seems like you've really taken what you had and you've grown it beyond what United Way was really looking for.
It's just timing. January of 2011, my supervisor said, hey, look, we had some people resign. And so he said, look, I think I'm going to place disaster underneath your cap. No problem. So I asked him, I said, well, that's great. I like a new challenge. And he said, yeah, we got VOADs that are forming, and, you'll be doing the VOAD meetings, but, it's not really that much work. January 2011. And he says, you probably want to, from a percentages, because we look at things in percentages. You spend 40% of your time doing this, 30% this, and you make up your week. He said, percentage-wise, you're probably going to spend about 10% of your time dealing with disaster stuff. He's like, you may go to a VOAD meeting once a month, and that's it. And so I said, okay, well, if it's only 10% of my time, then that should be a relatively easy thing to handle. January 2011. April 2011, biggest disaster in Alabama history. Touches, I think, 46 out of 50 something counties we have. So, yeah, I'm overwhelmed. And he flipped my scale immediately. He immediately said, look, spend 90% of your time working on that. And the other stuff that you got, 10%, and we'll figure it out. We'll figure out how to handle the other stuff. You focus on that disaster. And so we kind of built that bridge as we walked across it. And, he had a great idea in mind. I give him a lot of credit. He understood how long-term recovery should look. And so he was overlaying his model, and I was a piece of the puzzle, but I was the community outreach piece. And so, I had to, and again, when you're talking about a storm that affected the majority of the state, it just put me out there. Like, I could not I had to be in Walker County. I had to be in St. Clair County. I had to be in Jefferson County. I had to be in multiple neighborhoods. So it just, again, you talk about growing it. Well, that's where it grew from. And never really, it wasn't so much carte blanche as it was, hey, look, go as far as you can. And then, don't worry about, I had boundaries, and that's all I needed to know. But they were huge. They were wide boundaries. They were saying, okay, obviously you can't commit to rebuilding somebody's home. That's not your job. But you can absolutely go to anything that you need to go to, community meeting, whatever. You can talk to who you need to talk to and try to figure out how it connects. So if I heard about a meeting, I went to it. And that's kind of just how I built it. I was like, okay, well, some meetings turned out to be nothing. Others turned out to be huge. But I went to almost all of them for about 2 years.
So obviously this was something, the way you're describing it, that you had not done before. Not only the disaster portion, but the long-term recovery. And working with a VOAD, which means you're working with multiple agencies. Let me kind of break this down a little bit. So, starting with VOAD, how did it feel to start working with, and not that you were exclusive prior, but how did it feel to start working with different agencies?
It was familiar. I mean, we work with agencies on other issues, senior issues, homelessness. You're working with agencies, so the working with agencies part came easy. That's just, I mean, United Way has 76 agencies, partner agencies that we work with every year. So, agency partnerships was not an issue at all. I mean, that concept was very easy.
So how did it? So since you had that part kind of down, so how did it feel then? Come April 2011, huge amount of damage across a whole large swath of the state, and then, like you just said, your boss flipped your switch on what you were responsible for, and how many hours you were contributing to it, or working on that. How did that feel then to you coming in without a disaster background?
I care about, I mean, at the end of the day, I had two things in my mind. I have a job to do, and these people need help. And it was part personal because my aunt was affected. She lost her home in the disaster. She's fine. I mean, I don't want to, say she was disadvantaged, but it was part personal in that it was a neighborhood that I knew. Pratt City. My grandmother's from Pratt City. My mother's from Pratt City. My mother's family's from Pratt City, so I'm driving around the same streets that I've always driven around. I played with those streets as a kid, so it made it very easy to just say, you know what, do what it takes to help these people recover. But I cheated just a little bit. I went down to New Orleans and I talked to some United Way partners in New Orleans about how did they handle Katrina. I said, you all dealt with Katrina from a United Way angle. So what's your advice for me? And they took me around to some partners they work with in New Orleans and really helped me understand how I should act as United Way in regards to disaster recovery. And I'll never, ever, ever, as long as I live, forget the quote that he gave me. Because I asked him a question. I said, well, we're kind of like the 800-pound gorilla. And so, even if we shake your hand, we're still going to crush it. And so how do you deal with that? And he said, well, if you're the 800-pound gorilla, act like it. And I immediately thought, okay, that's a very bold statement. United Way generally likes to be the background support. And I said, you just told me, if you're the 800-pound gorilla, act like it. And he explained it. He said, well, what he meant by it is that if you have that much strength and that much standing in your community, you should be willing to put people on your back. And if you think about, like a baby gorilla hops on a mom's back or whatever, he said, you should put people on your back, put people on your shoulders, and go forward. And you should not worry about those folks that don't want to ride with you. You don't do anything to stop their progress. But you set the tone and you say, okay, this is the direction I'm going. And anybody who wants to go in this direction, I will clear the path. But you can, and so make it easier for those folks to get where they're going because maybe they don't have that same strength you have. And so that's the attitude I've always taken is that, okay, you know what? I can put a bunch of people on my back, using United Way, and we'll see what we can get done. And when it's time for some folks to get off, they get off. Some folks stay the whole ride. And then sometimes people say, well, I need you to go this way, and I can't. And I say, well, I just can't. And it's a nice way to be, but, helping the community is easy. I mean, that's what you do. I mean, we're all in our jobs to help, hopefully.
So that really sounds, the advice that he gave you really sounds like that really is the job for community outreach. You're building the relationships and that goodwill, that social capital. And then when the time is needed, people look to you, I guess, as an 800-pound gorilla because you've got the strength.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So let me ask you this. Now that you've gone through the biggest storm in Alabama history and you've come out the other side, what has that changed for you as far as your job and your goal for community outreach?
I don't think it's changed the goal so much as it is my perspective on. I tell you what's changed is it's hard for me to, and I've been dealing with this probably for about 2 years now. It's actually hard for me to adjust to smaller scale events. I know what to do if it's large scale because FEMA's going to come in and you're going to get the news coverage and we're going to do a telethon and we're going to get donations and You're going to get 3,000 volunteers out of the community. You're going to get folks from out of state coming in. The circus is in town, so to speak.
Right.
I know how to do that. Put on a church fair. Haven't done that in a while. What all do I need? I don't want to bring the Ferris wheel because it'll take up the whole parking lot. So I got to figure out that part. And that's what's hard for me now is at times I have to sit back and go, and again, you pick these little pieces of these little jewels you kind of pick up along the way. What I've had to figure out over the past 2 years is for that family that was affected by a storm a small overnight storm, that's their April 27th. And so I try to keep in mind that regardless of if it's 1,000 people affected or 10 people affected, for every one of those individuals, their life has been turned upside down. And if there's anything I can do to help, I want to do it. But I also want to be able to tell people what I can't do. And so I've actually spent a lot of time trying to figure out what I can't do, because in 2011 there was a lot I could do. Again, you had FEMA. We got donations in. Other folks got donations in. The governor's office got donations in. So there was all these resources available, and so it's very easy to tell folks we're going to fix that. Now it's become more difficult because I have to actually think to myself, what is my capacity? And so knowing now what I can do has become more important, because you never want to build people's hopes up if you can't meet that need.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So let me ask you now, with this amount of knowledge that you've received and your baptism by fire, what advice would you share with two groups? First group being your peers, and by your peers I mean folks that work in emergency management, not necessarily United Way, but all factors or all segments of that field.
I would say to the professional folks in emergency management, and when I say professional, I mean your EMAs, your fire departments, police departments, etc. Understand what we do and how we assist, because we come in after you all anyway. And more than likely, we're going to be in the community longer, and we may already be in the community longer than, and when I say longer, I just mean that, there's a very mission-oriented function for those agencies, official agencies, whereas, we're doing community building overall. We were looking at that community saying, well, you know what, we're working with food banks in that community. We're working with housing organizations in that community. The disaster touched all of those folks. And so, yes, we're going to play a disaster role as well, but that we're a community partner, and our interest is rebuilding the community, and we were already looking at building it forward. So understanding what we do, and us understanding what they do as well, and that helps. It's just understanding our roles and our place. And so, and that's an evolution, that's ongoing. To the agencies that are involved in disaster response, I would say that do a better job of educating the community on your role. A lot of times disaster agencies are so focused on what they're going to do when something happens, they fail to inform people of what they're going to do if something happens. And so the more we can educate folks on, and also preventive measures, the more we can educate folks on self-care. I think everybody in disaster has heard the phrase, they start local and end local. Take that to a smallest denominator. It starts at your house. It's going to end at your house. The better we prepare people individually, the easier it will be to recover a community.
Excellent. My second question for you is a different peer group, or not necessarily a peer group. This is actually students, future practitioners, and again, in every segment of emergency management, whether it be United Way, Red Cross, EMA, what advice would you give to them?
Students looking to get into the emergency. Never forget who you're serving and while your job may be to handle the warehouse or, whatever it may be, whatever resource that you're managing at that time, don't ever forget that those are people that you're serving. So if you're moving, let's make up something. Let's if your job is to transport 1,000 meals, think of it as 1,000 people that you've got to get food to. Don't just think about it as I've got to move 1,000 meals. And think about that resource on a very singular individual level and being responsible for that resource. My responsibility is to make sure that I connect these meals with the right people. And so it'll help answer questions that you may have along the way. You start asking yourself, well, what should I do? Do what helps the people. You're generally not going to get yourself in trouble if your focus is helping the people. We usually get in trouble when we start being overly concerned about, well, my agency doesn't do this, or I haven't been told it's okay to do that. I'm to a certain degree, I'm an apologist because I'd rather just apologize than ask permission when it comes to helping the people. I'd much rather say, you know what, I helped the people out and I got those meals. Didn't realize it wasn't within the boundaries of what I was, at the time, I didn't understand the boundaries. Again, not saying you defy orders or not saying you just totally just free will it. I mean, if you can come up with a plan, that's always great. But there are going to come moments when the plan doesn't overlay the disaster exactly as you were trained on. And when you get to those points where you're saying, I didn't train on this and I don't know what to do, keep the people in mind. Don't ever lose the people.
I think that's great advice for not only students, but for your peers as well.
Yeah. I learned it from my peers. It is shared amongst my peers. Absolutely. Do what's right for the people. Don't let, again, when you hit those gray areas, that's the easiest compass to find. But you try to eliminate the gray areas is the idea.
Right.
That's what we try to do. That's what I would say to people, in your 9 to 5 hours, try to eliminate the gray areas. Try to understand, plan for the unexpected. And then do review constantly. Constantly ask yourself how you can do what you do better. And then also understand that it's called disaster for a reason. So don't freak out if it doesn't quite look the way you studied. I see the analogy I would use is I was meeting with a doctor once and he's like, you know why they call it practicing medicine? Because you can never learn it. So all you do is practice. You never actually learn it. Because he said to me, here's the deal. A plumber can open up a wall and immediately look at the problem and say, oh, this pipe's turned upside down. Because that's the way pipes are supposed to go. He knows how they're supposed to look. What does a surgeon do when they cut open somebody's chest and they look in and they go, oh, that doesn't look like the diagram? They can't just close them up and say, oh, you know what? We didn't go over that. No, their job is to practice and figure out what it is, to do for that individual. So I kind of take the same approach to a lot of disaster work. It's called disaster for a reason. That's the reason it's not called, homeless outreach. Mm-hmm. It's called disaster outreach. And when you look at it, it may not look like the book. It may not look like the diagram, but you should see something familiar and just kind of build it from that point. And you start to put the piece of the puzzle together and each one is going to look different. So just understand that nature and don't freak yourself out. I think a lot of people get freaked out because they go, this doesn't fit the model. We did. I hate it all the time in disaster. Well, this is what we did. And that's what you needed to do at that time. Does that fit today is the first question you have to ask yourself. Because if it doesn't, then you need to let go of that idea and start building your next one. If it works, go with it. Lessons learned, always great. But the minute you discover it doesn't work, be honest with yourself and say, this does not fit this model. I've got to adapt.
Excellent. So adaptability.
Adaptability, absolutely.
All right. Well, Courtney, thank you very much. Before I let you go, if you would, again, this is Courtney Newton, and your official title is?
My official title is Assistant Vice President for Community Outreach for United Way of Central Alabama.